We are live. Four, five, six. Okay, we have most everyone here, so we'll get started since it's 6 o'clock. Call the meeting to order. Please join me for the Pledge of Allegiance. Pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Okay, first item on the agenda is approval or revision of the agenda. Another couple items we want to add to the agenda for this evening. So that would be the new business item 3.02, discussion of comment on the state ed recommendation to not have state assessments this spring. This item would be item 3.02, and item 3.03 would be a discussion of Jason, could you clarify, what did you want to have there?
Just to give the community an update on where we are with technology and the new Chromebooks that have come in, and just the kind of the overall status with where we are with that. Okay, sorry, I'm just reading emails, so I wanted to make sure. Okay, so I'm going to call it a Chromebook update. All right, thank you. There you go, that's it.
All right, good. So a 3.02 and a 3.03. Is there a motion to approve that amended agenda?
President Mims.
I'm sorry, yes?
President Mims, on the personnel tonight, we have coaching appointments. Is it the pleasure of the board to discuss interscholastic athletics, 3.04?
Yeah.
Okay, thank you. So we will add 3.04, interscholastic athletics. All right, thank you, Dr. Tice. Is there a motion to approve the revised agenda? Thank you, Sherry. Second from Jason. Any further discussion? All those in favor, please raise your hand, indicate aye. Aye. Anyone opposed or abstaining? Okay, thank you. First on the agenda, then item 2.01, the budget workshop. Mr. Furlong, Dr. Tice?
Certainly. As you know, this is our first budget workshop. It's also the Finance Committee made the decision to make this special meeting their January meeting. As you know, the governor released an executive budget that is tentative in many ways, and I will ask Mr. Furlong to walk us through. It's kind of a good news and a bad news, but his analysis is very well done, and I think at least for a first stab at the budget, we'll give you an overview of some of the challenges that we will face in budget development in the year ahead. Mr. Furlong, I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you, and I will share a presentation with you this evening. Can everybody see it?
Yes.
So, last year, the board members had requested budget workshops to be given, throughout the budget process. And our first workshop last year was in December, and basically it was intended to be kind of a budgeting 101 to kind of bring board members up to speed on, how we constructed the budget. We then would get into a second workshop about this time of year that had more to do with the revenue and the outlook on expenditures. And then we did a third workshop that was pretty much as we were wrapping up the budget process. This year, we decided to have 3 budget workshops, the first of which being late January, to review the revenue and expenditure outlook. And then knowing that it might be a very difficult budget year ahead, we had reserved the other two workshops for March, one in early March and one in later on in March, so that we could, discuss and decide and perhaps, need to make some hard decisions at those two workshops. That being said, this first workshop and the agenda for this evening is really to review our current revenue estimates. We do have estimates, as Dr. Tice alluded to, that the governor has issued his executive budget proposal, which outlines state aid for every school district throughout New York State. So we'll be spending some time on that. We'll also be looking at the preliminary tax levy limit calculation. There is a multi-step process for calculating the tax levy limit that we will have to live by for next year, and we can go through some of the knowns that we have at the current time. We'll also be spending some time on other revenue items and kind of going through those items and what's affecting them in the current year and perhaps next year as well. And then we'll talk about appropriated fund balance. So while appropriated fund balance is not a revenue source, it is in large part what the district has used to kind of bridge that gap between revenues and expenditures. We will then be looking at current expenditure assumptions for this next year, including payroll and staffing, employee benefits costs, pet debt payments, and looking at building and department level expenditures as well. So on the revenue side of the budget, brief overview is we have several bullets to present. First of all, the two largest revenue areas are property taxes and state aid. Going back to 2011, the legislature had passed and the governor signed in the law, Chapter 97, which basically instituted a property tax cap for all school districts and other municipalities throughout New York State. Basically, it restricts our tax levy increase to fall within certain guidelines. And basically, these guidelines account for inflation as measured by the Consumer Price Index. It also allows for growth in our tax base, and that's real brick and mortar growth, meaning new construction. And it also allows for increases due to exclusions for certain expenditures. In our particular case, that's really any capital expansion or capital spending can also influence the tax levy limit. Looking back at last year, at the current year, a little over 74% of our total revenues came from the tax levy. State aid, which is based upon the New York State annual budget. That budget is usually passed on or around April 1st each year when their fiscal year ends. By law, the governor has to issue a executive budget proposal in mid-January, which he did last week. And we use the governor's executive budget proposal as the basis for our preliminary budget development. Once the New York State budget is finalized and revenues are known, we will then adopt, modify the budget as we see fit and adopt a proposed budget in April. As you can see, in the current year, state aid accounted for a little under 23% of revenues. And over time, the amount of state aid as a percentage of our total revenue has declined significantly. If you go back 20, 30 years ago, the amount of state aid as a percent of our total revenue was a significantly higher amount. And it just continues the shift of the cost of public education from the state to the local taxpayer. So based upon the governor's executive budget proposal, there's a couple key items to note here. The first one being that similar to last year, the governor has taken almost all of the expense-driven aid categories and rolls them into a new aid category called services aid. The aid categories that he's grouped together include BOCES aid, transportation aid, and instructional materials aid. The concern here is really twofold. One is if all these aid categories are now merged into one, are we really seeing the increase? Because as I mentioned before, these are expense-driven aid categories. If we spend, money at BOCES or on transportation, we then get a certain percentage of that back to us the following year. If we lose visibility as to how much money we're spending in those areas, we might be not getting all the aid that we should be getting under the current state aid formulas. In addition, while these numbers have been rolled together, they've also been reduced. We are seeing, even though the overall increase in this area, there is an overall increase, we would have gotten even more had these items stayed separate. So that is definitely one of the areas that we will be advocating for our legislature not to pass and roll all these aid categories into one. In addition, the governor has created 2 additional aid categories. The first one is called the Local District Funding Adjustment. This happens to be a reduction, and a rather large reduction. At the same time, the governor added another category called COVID-19 Supplemental Stimulus Aid. And basically, this is money that is from federal sources. The concern here is it's almost like history repeating itself. If you go back to the recession back in 2008, initially there were shortfalls in the state funding, and the federal government stepped in and provided some relief in the first 2 years. But after that, there was no additional federal aid. And what resulted, what was called the gap elimination adjustment, which was a reduction in state aid that took 7 years to be fully restored. So the concern here is that, after the federal funding goes away, perhaps even a year from now, will that local district funding adjustment, which is a big negative, stay with us for a number of years? And that's a severe concern that we have right now. Another thing, another little twist that the governor proposed was he had included the STAR reimbursement as state aid. Now, there's 2 parts to this. Number one is the STAR reimbursement has always been where individual taxpayers receive a STAR exemption. And then, we basically are made whole by New York State. This appears to try and blend that reimbursement into state aid. And in addition, they are cutting our STAR reimbursement from year to year. So the concern would be is if this is really a backdoor, even though it looks like we're getting a big aid increase, at the same time, they're reducing the amount of STAR reimbursement year to year. And it's kind of a backdoor state aid reduction, if you will. All these items are items that we plan on talking with our Assemblyman, Al Sturpey, later this week. And, there's always a lot of devil in the details when it comes to the governor's executive budget proposal. So we'll be, keeping a close eye on analysis conducted by a variety of entities, including the New York State School Boards Association, the New York State Association for School Business Officials, and the New York State Council of School Superintendents. This next slide shows line by line what state aid we're going to be getting according to the governor's executive budget proposal compared to the current year budget, not current year actual, but current year budget. As you can see, now one thing, I did not list STAR on this report because I want it to be an apples to apples comparison. So the STAR reimbursement is not listed in either the current year or next. As you can see, foundation aid is exactly the same as current year. This will be 2 years in a row that foundation aid will be frozen. What's problematic about that is the state still owes like $3.8 billion to fully fund foundation aid. And yet here we are 2 years in a row seeing it frozen. Foundation aid is really it's the largest aid category in each school district. It really is not tied to any other expenditures. It's really the lifeblood in terms of state aid for every school district. And once again, it is frozen at the current year level. The next line is that new services aid, and you can see that we didn't get anything in the current year, and next year we're going to be getting $7.7 million. But as you look down, you can see where BOCES aid, we're not getting anything. Same thing goes for instructional materials aid and transportation aid, because those are the three aid categories that are making up services aid now. While there's an overall net increase, that increase once again would have been larger had those aid categories been separated out and continued under what's called current law. The fourth aid category down the list is high cost aid. That is money that we receive based on high cost special education students. If we're spending over a certain threshold, we then get aid for those costs. And you can see that our costs are going up this year, and we will get more aid next year because of that. Skipping down to building aid, you can see that we are going to be getting a little bit of a bump in building aid. I know when we put out our state aid comparison report based upon the aid runs that were put out, we were showing a smaller building aid in the current year than what we had budgeted. We have reconciled that number, and we will be getting everything that we did think was going to be budgeted. It really had to do with the timing of final cost reports being issued, but we will save that discussion for our next finance committee meeting. But we do feel very confident we're going to be getting the entire $3.4 million in building aid in the current year. And then we will see a slight increase next year because of some other projects that are coming on stream here. The next two lines are the new aid categories that the governor has outlined. You can see the local district funding adjustment is a whopping $3.9 million deduction in aid. And then the next line is an addition of the same exact amount, and that will be federal money dependent upon how much we get from the federal government. The governor's budget, if you saw his budget address, he alluded to building two budgets at the state level. One was on $6 billion funding from the federal government. The other was on $15 billion. I did confirm that the budget numbers that we have here are based on the $6 billion number. It's on the lower of the two. So, we'll just have to wait and see how that plays out once the federal stimulus is approved, how much we actually get at that point. The last line item, pandemic adjustment, was actually what we had seen in the current year, or budgeted in the current year. The federal government, when they passed the first CARES Act, had allocated $170,000 to the Fayetteville-Manlius Central School District to help us through the pandemic. While that amount was welcome, it was kind of inadequate in terms of what our real costs were. We knew that the state was going to have to look at not having enough revenue to give us all of the state aid we had anticipated or budgeted. So we had basically added a $500,000 negative to that line in anticipation of mid-year state aid cuts. Now, obviously, that's not being budgeted for this next year, so it shows a positive year-to-year variance. So when you add down all the aid categories, we're going to be under the governor's budget proposal, increasing our state aid by almost $1.6 million. Probably 2 weeks ago, I would have thought that was not possible. So I was pleasantly surprised by that. In looking at aid runs for districts either within Onondaga County or throughout the state, I think we're kind of fortunate to be getting that amount. In part, it's because we had planned for that pandemic adjustment, that $500,000 cushion that we build into the current year budget, comes back to benefit us next year. So, once again, we're cautiously optimistic that we will get the $1.6 million, but it's heavily dependent upon the federal stimulus money and what that ends up being. As for the tax levy limit, the one main factor is consumer price index. It's an inflation factor. That was finalized earlier in January, and that factor is 1.23%. Going back a year ago, it was 1.81, so it's considerably less. In fact, this is probably the second lowest CPI number since the tax levy limit or tax cap was implemented back in 2011. There was 1 year where it was virtually nothing. But this is the second lowest year on record since that tax levy limit was implemented. We do have a taxable growth factor, and once again, this is brick and mortar growth. It's not changes in assessments as much as new construction. And last year it was slightly under 0.5%. This year it equates to slightly more than 0.5%. So it's been fairly consistent for a couple of years now. As for the capital exclusion, that is yet to be determined. We do know that we have additional debt, so we know that tax levy, that will slightly increase the tax levy limit. And for planning purposes, we're currently looking at about 0.5%, but we feel it could be a little bit higher than that. So if we combine the first two factors, the CPI and the taxable growth factor, we're looking at a 1.8% tax levy increase. If we then add 0.5% due to the capital exclusion, we'd be looking at a 2.27% tax levy increase. And for preliminary budget purposes, we're planning on using that number. As a point of comparison, the tax levy increase last year was 3.33%. Now, due to projected or continued growth in the tax base, we do anticipate that the tax rate increase will once again be significantly lower than the levy increase. And once again, if we get, a 2 to 3% growth in the tax base, overall growth in the tax base, we'll be looking at rate increases around 0. So as for all other revenues, we do have quite a few categories of miscellaneous revenue. As with the expenditure side of the budget, we tend to budget this area more conservatively. Once again, it's a wide variety. It's everything from interest income and tuition payments, different fees and related to either facility use, sales tax that we get from Onondaga County, sales of surplus assets, et cetera, et cetera. We also get Medicaid, are able to bill from certain Medicaid services that we provide. And we also get a subsidy from the federal government by carrying health insurance for our retirees. Once again, we usually budget these based upon the trend. We kind of look back about 3 to 5 years, see what the trend is, and then we adjust from there depending on current events. I know interest rates were significantly low for quite some time. They then started to peak and come up a little bit to something that's been more historical, reasonable number for us to invest in. But, of late, interest rates have dropped dramatically again. So we'll be reducing interest income. This is a snapshot of all of the other revenue categories that we have. If you look at the far right, you'll see that the majority of categories, we're showing a decrease. Now, some of them make sense. I mentioned interest income. We're back down to historic lows in interest income rates or interest rates. So our interest income has really fallen off. We know that the county is taking a fairly substantial hit on sales tax revenue, and they share that sales tax revenue with school districts. So we are looking at a reduction there. Now, this is a first pass. We're probably going to take a hard look or a harder look at every one of these areas to see if we can, raise the budget a little bit more. But for now, these are for the first pass of the budget, we're going to be using these numbers for the other revenue categories. The one thing I do want to point out is the two bottom lines. Donations, as you know and approved at the last board meeting, we are now going to receive donations from an energy company that's going to be installing 2 solar farms within the district. In lieu of pilot payments, they are going to make direct donations, one-time donations for each of those solar farms. And we are going to see a windfall of $325,000 because of that. So we are going to be budgeting that for the next year. And the last line is the appropriated fund balance. And we'll get a little bit more into what that is, but you can see that that's a significant increase. Typically, we have been historically around the $750,000 number. Last year, we increased it to $840,000 because we had an unexpected pilot payment. So we gave it back to the taxpayers through that means. But right now, we're looking at an even $2 million of appropriated fund balance. And we'll talk about why on the next slide. So as a reminder, fund balance is simply the accumulated surplus over time. Every year we tend to have a small to moderate surplus, and that basically falls into fund balance. Due to COVID-19, there have been, a multitude of operational cost savings that we have seen. We haven't been running our buses like we normally do. You think back to March through June, students weren't in the building, staff wasn't in the building, we weren't transporting like we normally do, we weren't heating the building like we normally do, the lights weren't on like they normally are. So we saw, some substantial operational cost savings. Sports weren't running as they normally do either. So, we look at appropriated fund balance as a vehicle to take those savings and return them to the taxpayer so that we don't have to raise taxes anymore, or so that we don't have to cut programs. So the last bullet simply states that we're looking at increasing or utilizing a significant portion of that savings so that we can keep our tax increase reasonable and so that we can maintain all the programs that we currently offer our students.
Bill?
Yes.
Just a quick question. Can you go back to the prior slide one second?
I sure can.
So I know that you said you're looking at, prelim number of $2 million of incorporating it into this year's budget. Mm-hmm. What is that total number that not that we want to spend it all, but what is that total number that would be available to us?
It really depends on where we finish the current year. We did underspend the budget, last year by a couple $1 million. We are running once again a surplus in the current year, but that number, changes almost from day to day. Sometimes we get more savings than we thought. With the announcement of sports starting up again, there's going to be some expenditures associated with that. So, as soon as we kind of go through and are constantly looking at what that number is and monitoring it to make sure that we are getting the savings we think we're supposed to be getting. But once again, as things change, that number changes. But what I can do, I'd be happy to do, is to kind of put together a little report, as of, tomorrow or the day after, and say, this is currently where we're at. And I'd be happy to share that with not only the finance committee, but the whole board.
Yeah, just for next board meeting. It doesn't need to be that urgent, Bill, but just to give us an idea, that would be great.
And I was thinking of actually having that for our next finance committee, kind of giving you update. I believe that people did receive the finance committee update letter. And
Yeah.
I kind of outlined that, but I didn't talk specifically about a number yet. But I'd be happy
Okay.
to put that together for our next finance committee meeting.
That'd be great. Thanks, Bill.
So as for the expenditure side of the budget, and once again, this is just an overview. We're still in the middle of finalizing the expenditure budget. We pretty much have all the payroll put together, all the benefits. We know what building requests have been made. We know what IT requests have been made. What we're really missing is two parts. One, I'm going to learn tomorrow, which is what our workers' compensation costs will be next year. The other one is the BOCES expenditures, and Dr. Tice and I will be attending a meeting the second week of February, where we will be receiving more information on what the BOCES expenditures are for next year. So at that point, that'll be the last piece of the puzzle, so we can finalize the first pass of the budget. But in the meantime, we can talk about some higher level things. So, first and foremost, we put together the district strategic plan. We've updated that a couple times now. And the budget will include funding to support any initiatives that are included in the district strategic plan. We are expecting staffing to be virtually the same as in the current year. So we don't see any staffing changes significantly one way or the other. We are forecasting payroll based upon existing collective bargaining agreements. Yet we do have 4 bargaining units that will be up for negotiation between now and the end of the school year. So we'll be looking at, budgeting based upon projected changes that are yet to be negotiated. We do know that there's going to be some cost increases in some of the benefits areas, specifically health insurance and retirement system costs. We'll talk about that in a little bit. And, in the current year, and I think this kind of dovetails well into the conversation that we might have later. In the current year, we needed to reallocate some of our technology equipment money to purchase Chromebooks so we could move to a one-to-one and keep our learning virtual and making sure that, all students had devices. Basically, that took money away from other purchases that were part of our replacement plan. It also took money away from other areas like furniture and equipment that we had planned for spending in other areas of the district. But what we don't want to get too far behind on is our replacement plan, because we want to kind of make up for that. So we are looking at increasing the budget for instructional technology equipment in this next year. And as I think I alluded to earlier, we have some new debt from recently completed or ongoing building projects that will also be added to the budget this year. So as for key assumptions related to payroll and benefits, on the payroll side, once again, we think staffing is going to be flat. We already talked about contractual salary increases. The one area I did want to talk about was breakage. Now, breakage, for those who might be viewing this online, breakage is really the difference between the salary we would pay a retiring teacher and the salary we'd be paying a new teacher. And there can be a significant delta or cost difference between those two. So, in a typical year, we pretty much know most of the retirements in time that we can budget for them, and we budget that breakage. However, in the current year, as people would guess, it's a very unusual year. we had a significant number of retirements that were announced either in June or as late as August. And, basically it was after we had set the budget, the payroll budget for the current year. So we're going to see, while we may not see much breakage for people who are retiring at the end of this school year, we are actually seeing considerable breakage for those teachers and staff members that retired at the end of last school year, because those monies were still budgeted in the current year. So that is, something that will help be a pressure relief valve in some way to the budget. As for the benefit side, we're looking at health insurance premiums to go up no more than 5%. I happen to be on the executive committee of the health insurance cooperative. And, we've done a lot of discussion about, premiums. The 5% is probably the lowest increase in the last probably 5 or 6 years. There is concern because basically we are seeing the cost of care has gone down significantly in the current year because, hospitals aren't operating like normal. A lot of the procedures that were perhaps not absolutely necessary have been put off. A lot of people in the community may not feel comfortable having their normal checkup as they would normally. So, we are seeing a reduction in what claims are being paid throughout this region. However, the concern is that normally the inflation on healthcare costs is about 7% a year. So the concern is, if it's 7% a year, if we have increases of less than 7%, is that going to come back and bite us at some point? There's also a concern that we might see some inflation once the pandemic eases, that providers might be raising rates to kind of make up for the losses that they're incurring during the pandemic. So we're going to have to wait and see on that. But right now, the cooperative is looking at no more than a 5% increase, and it could possibly be lower, possibly. The next two items, TRS and ERS. TRS is the Teachers Retirement System, and that covers all certified teachers, teaching assistants, and administrators. The current employer contribution percentage is 9.53%. So for every $100 in salary we pay, we have to contribute $9.53 towards the teacher's retirement system. In December of each year, the New York State Teachers Retirement System issues guidance as to what they think the employer contribution is going to be for the following year. And they usually issue a range, and as you can see, they've issued a range of 9.5% to 10%. Typically, their range is more like 1%. Like this past year, it was 9.25% to 10.25%. They settled at 9.53. So we'll have to wait and see. Typically, the New York State Retirement System issues their employer contribution by the end of January. So we're coming up close. I did look today, but I didn't see any notification that they had published that today yet. But we should expect it within a week or so. If it was worst case that we did go to 10%, that is a 5% increase. And it's a 5% increase on $3.5 million. So it would be a sizable jump in expenditure. On the ERS side, which is the employee retirement system, and that basically covers everybody that I did not mention before, well, teachers and teaching assistants and administrators covered by TRS. Every other district employee is covered by ERS. And you can see that the employer contribution is a larger percentage. And that rate has already been announced because it carries a different plan year. And we're going from 14.6% to 16.2%. That's an 11% overall increase. Well, the base is a lot less than the retirement system cost. We're talking probably about $1.5 million, $1.6 million. It's still, an 11% increase on that amount. So it is significant. So debt payments. So we have basically three things that are coming due in 21-22. We have incurred new debt related to financing the Wellwood project. And while that project won't be done until the summer of 22, we do have some ongoing financing where we are doing some bond anticipation notes where we will be needing to pay some principal and interest in the meantime. We recently completed the energy performance contract, or it's virtually complete. There's just a little fine tuning left to do. That will be generating energy cost savings. So we know that we're going to be getting those in the future. And lastly, the school buses that we purchased last year, or I'm sorry, in the current school year, that debt will start impacting the school district budget next year. But I would like to remind everybody that, if there's any debt related to construction, either at the Wellwood site or the energy performance contract, that cost will generate building aid at 79%. And the purchase of school buses is covered by transportation aid, which is at 73%. So we will be getting the majority of those costs back in either transportation aid or building aid next year. As for building and department level budgets, in order to keep things fair and equitable between buildings, we create supply quotas on everything from instructional supplies used in the classroom to, virtually everything. Basically we do that once again so that there's an equitable distribution, either between Fayetteville Elementary, Enders Road, or Mott Road based on enrollment, or between Wellwood and Eagle Hill based on enrollment. In addition, each building and each department can make specific requests for additional supplies based upon specific needs, which we try and incorporate into the budget. There is also instructional technology requested through Josh and Laurel as to what what they think they need at the building level, and we pretty much couple that with our replacement plan to generate the instructional technology budget for the following year. In addition, every building has certain maintenance projects that we work through our Director of Facilities, Russ McCarty, and determine what the cost of those projects is and include them in the budget as well. Basically, we've taken, for the first pass of the budget, everything that has been requested, and we've included that in the budget. So we have not made any reductions for now, but it really depends on what our revenue picture looks like as well. One of the reasons we could do that, and I really want to commend our building administrators and department supervisors. They knew that it was going to be a tough budget year. They knew there was a lot of uncertainty, and they were, I use the word very frugal, maybe extremely frugal might be better, in their request for the current year. There wasn't a lot of ask for anything that was outside of what was absolutely necessary to run their buildings, and that was very much appreciated. So to summarize the budget outlook, the main driver of increases to the budget will be contractual salary increases, health insurance, and retirement system costs, coupled with the new debt that we're looking to add this next year. The state aid increase, coupled with the tax levy increase, and utilizing the operational savings that we saw not only from March to the end of last year, but in the current year, will produce a balanced budget. I have no doubt that we'll be able to make that work. The only caveat would be if the wheels really fell off in terms of state aid, but based upon the governor's executive budget proposal, I just don't see that happening. The budget does include funding to support the district's strategic plan. And at current time, and once again, the big caveat is, the federal funding, there are currently no plans to make any reductions to any educational program that we offer our students. We plan on continuing everything. This budget has been constructed as if we were operating in a normal year. The students in our buildings 5 days a week and offering all the programs that I think sets us apart as one of the school districts of choice in Central New York and New York State for that matter. So looking at the future, the second budget workshop is scheduled for March 8th. By then we'll have the full expenditure picture. We'll have a better idea of where the state budget process is headed. And at that time, we'll be able to give a complete review of the expenditure budget. We'll also review the preliminary revenue budget that you saw for the most part this evening. And then we'll discuss, where we can go from there, whether we feel the budget, is adequate enough to service our students and community, or whether we need to, make some changes. As for budget workshop number 3, which would be 2 weeks later, you'll basically take, what we decide upon at the second workshop and revise the budget from there. The board is looking at, there will be a proposed budget presentation and adoption by the full Board of Education on the meeting on April 19th, which is before the deadline as established by New York State. The budget hearing, once again, has to be 7 to 14 days prior to the budget vote, and that's scheduled for May 10th. And then we'll be looking at the annual budget vote on May 18th, provided that that date isn't changed like it was last year. Hopefully it will remain the third Tuesday in May this coming year and for years to come. Any questions that the board may have?
Bill, is it time for us to schedule our, you mentioned earlier you were going to meet with Assemblyman Sturpey.
Mm-hmm.
I haven't seen a notice, maybe I've missed it, about the annual Capitol Conference. We usually have our meetings with both of our legislators around that time. So is there are you going to be meeting with Senator Mannion as well? Or is it time for us to schedule our legislative meetings with Sturpey and Mannion?
I'm going to defer to Dr.
Discuss the budget and other issues.
I would recommend that we schedule our meetings. A lot is being done virtually, as you might imagine. This is just a preliminary meeting with Assemblyman Sturpey that's scheduled for this week.
Okay, well, that's something our legislative liaisons could work on then, scheduling those meetings and putting together what issues we might want to discuss with them, including the budget, of course.
And that meeting scheduled for this week also includes several other districts as well. Okay. Where I know we typically, when we have other meetings that we schedule, it's more one-on-one between Fayetteville-Manlius board members and administrators and those individual elected representatives.
You're talking about the Saturday morning meeting, Bill. Are other board members planning to attend? I did register, but I just wondered. Marissa?
I also plan to attend.
Oh, good, Sherry.
Registered as well, Daryl.
Okay, wonderful.
You all are invited. It's hosted by Central New York School Boards Association, as you know, and Dr. Rick Timms will be there from the statewide school finance consortium.
Right, thank you. Well, that was very helpful and very thorough. Thought you did a great job. Thank you.
Thank you, Daryl.
Well, I just have I know you're going to get us more numbers on this, but just a question on the appropriated fund balance of it going up from an historical 750,000 to 2 million, which obviously is a pretty big increase to cover that gap. But historically, we budget for that fund balance transfer, but then don't end up needing it in most years or making it in most years. I'm just, my question is, and then instead of that, whatever's, we run balances has been moved into various reserve accounts. By increasing it to that level, if we don't make that transfer, are we not reducing the amounts that would be available for reserve funding?
Well, what I have in mind is that appropriate fund balance can come from reserves. And, since we're seeing some significant increases in both the TRS and ERS, I'd like to fund, a portion of that $2 million would be to fund those increases for TRS and ERS. That's just an example. But once again, it doesn't necessarily have to come from the undesignated fund balance. It can come from the reserves. And actually, the establishment of reserves, when the auditors come in, they want to see that you're actually using those reserves. So, we plan on using the unemployment reserve in the current year because our unemployment costs have gone up significantly. So we have the reserve balance to cover that. But with next year, seeing that both our retirement system costs for TRS and ERS going up substantially, we feel that that's the best way is to then fund that. So a portion of that $2 million appropriated fund balance would come out of the TRS reserve and the ERS reserve. That's just one example and something that I also wanted to have prepared for the Finance Committee for our next meeting is exactly how we utilize that $2 million appropriated fund balance.
All right, so and just a follow up on the same topic is, this past year, last fiscal year when we closed and everything went upside down, potentially budget wise, a decision was made not to fund the capital reserve. And so I'm curious in this upcoming year, starting with the current year, not just the upcoming year, but current year, are you projecting a continued ability to fund that capital reserve in any respect or not at all?
I think it really depends on how we finish the current year. If we finish the current year and we get the state aid that we feel we need without needing to trim programs, I would think that we would take a look at that, see if we need to do that. But I think it's something we have to look at holistically. We have to look at how much savings do we get. How much do we feel we can put in reserves for that rainy day? Because the other concern I have is I'm not so sure this is a 1 year financial problem. This is eerily like what happened back in 2008, where after the federal money went away, there were state aid reductions that lasted 7 years. Where Fayetteville-Manlius at the high water mark, we were losing $3.4 million a year. So I really want to, take a hard look. The board can, take what money is in surplus and put it into the cap reserve. That doesn't have to be at year end, but I'd like to kind of see where we finish this year out, see what savings we do get. But obviously there might be an opportunity to add to that cap reserve. We do have a voter authorization to go up to $10 million. There's currently almost $5 million in the reserve. So I think we could add to that reserve, but I think it's a little bit premature to say right today whether we want to add to it or not. I think we really want to wait and see how we close out the year. That might be something that we take a hard look, we're closing the books in July and August.
I'm just to stand there for a second. I'm just hoping that can stay on everybody's radar through this process. So when we talked about that last year, during our last fiscal year, about reducing that cap transfer. We had quite a full discussion about that as a board, and my recollection had agreed essentially on a consensus that we would significantly reduce it, but still fund it, because we know that we have significant future capital construction needs. And then it did end up not being funded last fiscal year, and we all know what the impact is of not funding it. The more that we have available in that cap reserve, the less the tax impact as these future building projects go forward. So I would hope that we could get back to, as you're projecting a surplus for this year, that we could get back to funding that cap reserve at least to some level, so that we have an offset in future years on those capital projects that are coming down the pike.
The one concern I would mention would be we do want to manage those reserves properly, so that if we did get the federal funding this year, and then next year we don't get it, and the state keeps that $3.9 million reduction, now we have a $4 million hole in our budget. And once we put money into the cap reserve, then you can't get it out unless you use it for capital. So the concern would be is we put money aside and then a year later find out, oops, we need that, we don't have it, and now we're going to have to cut program because of it. That is a major concern of mine, is that this is not a one-year issue. I think this year we can bridge the gap. I think we're well positioned where we are currently. The concern would be, if this happens to impact us financially for 2, 3, 4 years in a row, we're going to need all the reserves to cover it, cover that type of financial downturn.
No, I agree. And that's the same discussion we had last year about reducing it, but talking about still making sure that we had some, because the one thing we're not going to be able to get away from, no matter what the state aid formula is that we have future building needs. That's something that's not going to go away. So it's going to have to be funded in some respect. So I'm just asking that sort of be kept on everybody's radar as we move through the rest of this fiscal year.
And, you mentioned cap transfer earlier. There's the funding of the capital reserve, which I think you're alluding to.
Yes.
There's also built within the budget, and we feel we're going to maintain that same level of $450,000 that will go through for, short or smaller capital projects that we do each year. And, this year we're going to be completing some carpeting replacement at Enders Road and some repaving work on Pride Lane. We're planning on keeping that same $450,000 in the budget, in the preliminary budget, and that we will continue with those two items as well, to continue the replacement of carpet at Enders Road and to continue the paving or repaving at Pride Lane.
Right. No, I was talking about the fund appropriation, not the cap transfer, but thank you.
Other questions?
I'm just curious, with this 3.9 million that they're anticipating for federal stimulus, do we know how the state came up with that number? And at this point, do we have any way to anticipate if that number is possible?
I haven't dug into it enough to see, for the total for the state. What I've been told is that you've heard the governor talk about $6 billion in federal money, or $15 billion. He would like to have $15 billion. But this budget is predicated on the $6 billion. The budget that he announced last week was based on that. And I think the governor knows that this is not a one-year problem. So I think that, even if the state did receive the $15 billion, he would probably be wise to keep a lot of that, for the following year. And the other wild card in this is how fast the economy bounced back statewide after the pandemic. I don't know if I have a really good answer for that. You know, I would like to think that the governor isn't just making these recommendations without having some sort of backdoor information. I would find it hard to believe that there hasn't been conversations between the governor's office and the federal government. I know that with President Biden has put out, you know, a plan that he's trying to get passed that included $350 billion for state and local governments. And, you know, I would think it reasonable that New York State would get easily $6 billion out of that, and maybe as high as $15 billion. But I find it hard to believe the governor doesn't have some inside information on that he knows exactly how much we're going to get if that stimulus package is passed, especially given that Schumer is now going to be the Senate Majority Leader.
Bill, just on that, I know this is incredibly hard to predict, and so probably not answerable, but New York's got a history as a state that when the federal government steps in and provides aid for a particular need, such as schools, the state has a history of pulling back the state aid and saying, well, you're getting what we would have given you, so you don't need our money anymore, and we're going to move that to general funds to balance state budget. Do you have any sense at all how this would play out in this scenario?
Well, it's exactly what is happening or has happened. You know, in the current year, I mentioned that 170,000 from the CARES Act. What I failed to mention was why it ended up being a negative was the federal government gave us 170,000. The state government reduced our state aid by 170,000. And that's exactly what's happening. If I go back to that slide, let me go back to so, you know, you look at these lines down here, the local district adjustment funding, you know, basically they're reducing state aid by the 3.9 million that he thinks he's going to get, or that we're going to get from the federal government. So it's exactly what you just said, is that, okay, the federal government's going to give Fayetteville-Manlius 3.9. Okay, I'll take 3.9 away. And that's the concern, is that, you know, a year or two down the road, does the federal money go away? And now we're stuck with, you know, a 3.9 negative. And even if the federal or even if the state governments tried to erode that, how long do you think it would take for them to give us 4 million more? Might take several years. And I know the gap elimination adjustment, the high water mark was 3.4 million here at FM. It took 7 years to get that fully restored. So, you know, we're going to have to wait and see. I wouldn't say we're out of the woods by any stretch of the imagination, but, you know, at least for this next budget year, I feel very comfortable with where we are based upon the governor's executive budget proposal, as long as we get that federal stimulus money.
So I have one more. I just don't want to cut in if anybody else does first. Okay, hearing silence. Bill, you answered in your presentation the one question that I ask you every year, which is, was there anything or has there anything been requested by our educational staff that isn't included or budgeted for? And you said it's all included in this preliminary first run. But you also said it was based on very frugal requests from the building administrators. So my question is, were they given caps, hard caps to work within, or were they given freedom to say, tell us what you need and let's figure out what fits in the budget?
They were given freedom, except for the quotas. We did reduce the quotas. If you recall, in the current year, we did reduce instructional materials by 20%. But at the same time, at the end of the previous school year, we had some additional money and we let people buy ahead. I would like to see if we're in a place to do that again this year. that when we get, past the budget vote, see where we are closing out the year, is there some additional money that we can utilize? But the one thing I wanted to also mention, while we've been in a spending freeze, that spending freeze has not affected instruction. It has not affected school operations. If we had a bus that needed a part to keep that bus safe and on the road, we would buy it. If we needed to fix a unit ventilator in a classroom to make sure there was proper ventilation, we would buy those parts. Same thing goes for whether it was, art or science or music or, family and consumer science. We would buy everything that we needed to continue the educational mission here at FM. But that being said, I have to commend people at all levels. People, they understood the situation and they would only request what they really needed. There were very few requests that came through that, were absolutely not what people needed. And, I think once we get past, and answer your question, I think once we get past the May vote, we'll take a hard look at where we are in terms of savings in the current year. And I think we could release some of that and, tell people at the building level and the department level, is there anything you did without that you really need now? And let's see if we can make a purchase out of the current year funds.
Thanks, Bill. Appreciate it. The very last question I had is when we did the current year's budget, I think the number, if I remember, it was 1.2 million in items that were approved but then frozen.
1.1, yeah. Yep.
Has that been released or is that still frozen?
That is still frozen. That's still locked away.
Okay.
It's still locked away. Any other questions? Once again, I appreciate the opportunity to, present this to the board. If you do have any other questions after tonight's meeting, feel free to give me a call or email me and I'll be happy to get the answers to you.
Thank you, Bill.
Thanks, Bill.
Thanks, Bill.
Thank you very much, Bill, for a very informative report. Right. Next on the agenda, item 3.01, personnel. Is there a motion to approve the personnel actions as recommended by the superintendent? Thank you, Daryl. And a second from Kelly. All those in favor, please raise your hand and indicate aye. Aye. Anyone opposed or abstaining? Next on the agenda, item 3.02. This afternoon, everyone, you're like me and didn't get to your email right away. Maybe you're just seeing it. There was a letter from the NISBA onboard editor about state ed inviting comments on test waiver requests. So the state education department is going to ask the U.S. Department of Education to waive state testing requirements at the elementary, middle, and high school levels for the remainder of the school year. I understand that includes the third grade through eighth grade test and also the spring regions. So they are taking public comments from school officials and others. You can send comments in through February 5th. And there's a question as to whether or not the board would like to send in a comment in support of this or the district. What are folks' thoughts about that?
We discussed it as a district office team. Obviously, there's concerns about moving forward with state testing. We understand the accountability issues that the state testing was promulgated for and under, but time is just so valuable right now during the pandemic, and we would hate to waste time. We know there's learning loss as a result of the pandemic. Certainly the situations are not optimal, and we're just unsure as to what this will be measuring, given the fact that every district has approached their reopening plan differently. So at this point, I can certainly allow the other district office administrators to speak to it, but certainly it's just a burden that we feel is unnecessary given the fact that we are not operating optimally this year.
Okay, so, I mean, we can certainly put together a statement and run it by the board. Something I think it should be, is it something we're looking from Dr. Tice or from the Board of Education or both? Or what is everyone's thoughts on that?
Which has greater impact, one letter from the entire board or a whole bunch of letters from the entire district governing body and administration?
Well, I think we should share this link because only the board president through the board and the superintendent can speak on behalf of the district. But certainly if we have our teachers or administrators who want to on their own accord and our parents, of course, parents would be the, when you talk about what's going to have the most impact, I think it would be the parents sending in messages. I think that would have even a greater impact than us doing it. To let the federal government know what their thoughts are in support of this. So I think we should share that link so that members of the community can certainly send in their thoughts.
I would think at the very least that there would be a letter from the board and a letter from Dr. Tice. And I totally agree with disseminating the link and with what Dr. Tice said earlier, which I've said multiple times this year, which is we've got 2 days a week in school with students. Spending them on standardized testing at this point is just a horrific waste of time.
All right, is everybody good with that then? So we can work on a draft. We'll 2 letters and we'll run them by the board before they're posted. They have to be posted by February 5th. And oops, sorry, Sherry.
Oh, would you like that to be a task for you and I or for legislative liaisons? I'm sorry?
I said we're
the
good
legislative
at it.
liaisons can work on that as well.
Well, I mean, I think we're good at it anyway.
Yeah. Oh, yeah.
We certainly can get that
We know what
and
you're
then Dr. What's that?
I said, we know what we're doing. So just want
And
to
then
get something
Dr.
off of your shoulders, Marissa.
Dr. Tice, can we put that link like with an article or something on the website? Do you think that would be okay?
Yeah, I will talk to our community relations committee, Ms. Cohen. I think certainly that's something we can do and put out to the public.
Yeah, I would urge the website as well as social media just a couple different ways to make sure people are aware that that's an option for them.
I concur. Some of you may have been following the media with President Biden's nominee for the Secretary of Education as the commissioner from Connecticut, who is a data guru. So I do know that he would like the testing to continue. So as the NSBA release today indicated, it would be pending federal approval. And he's looking at it from measuring learning loss. So it's almost the converse of what it's been used for in the past. He's trying to do a before and after picture, but again, at what expense? So it'll be interesting to see whether the federal government takes this feedback from the field and realizes that the ends do not, justify the means. And as Mr. Seidberg said, time away from instruction.
It's always a nightmare to administer them, but under these circumstances, it would be worse than that for poor Dr. Coughlin, right?
And she knows, and Dr. Coughlin articulated it today, that remote C cohort would not be tested. So we would not even meet the 95% requirement to have everybody tested. So it would be one folly after the next.
I think it would be nice if we even had the articles to quote, or the letters that we write as superintendent and board in the article, just so our community understands the arguments we're making and the advocacy we're doing, and also to be able to piggyback on some of that language and reinforce it.
Good point.
So that gives us a quick turnaround, because if we want to have those letters published to the community and the community still has to have it in by February 5th, we'd want to get those letters out this week.
All right, Sherry, we have a Google Doc date.
I'm happy to help with editing as well if you'd like, or drafting. Just let me know.
I'll send the link to you as well, Rebecca.
Thank you.
If there's nothing further on that item, item 3.03, a community update on Chromebooks. Dr. Tice?
Certainly. I know Mr. Catalino had asked a question, and again, my apologies for not making this clear. He said he had a question or had heard from others. As you know, in the spring, we tried to beat the fiscal year by purchasing the Chromebooks ahead of time, anticipating one-to-one with our students. We wanted those to be delivered in advance of the start of the school year. We did get the order in ahead of time. The order was delayed in 2-week intervals, basically, and finally showed up in early October. So that's why I included the timeline from our instructional technology department. It was at that time we decided, given the lag and the fact that they were back ordered, and I think we got such a great rate on those units, they probably were sold 2 or 3 times over for a higher rate given the supply and demand issues. That's why we put a subsequent order in, as Mr. Becker indicated, for 312 Chromebooks to supplement that. That was taken, as Mr. Furlong indicated in his budget presentation tonight, out of equipment money. So it isn't that money suddenly became available, which was one of Mr. Catalino's follow-up questions. We just decided to prioritize the equipment money and to purchase the Chromebooks, again, given the lag time we experienced on the initial order. As our instructional technology department indicated, no student has been without. If you as a governance team are hearing that somebody is without, please let us know. We did check in with our instructional technology person today, put her on speakerphone. Dr. Coughlin had it on her phone, and we were able to ascertain that, to the best of our knowledge, that the students are connected and moving forward with that. We are still awaiting delivery on those 312 Chromebooks. It's been pushed back from January to February, and now I believe it's an April date, is what Laurel said today.
So Craig, I think, so how did the process work in the high school? In terms of the note that you sent back indicated that it looked like a significant number of students had volunteered to use their own devices, which is fine and great. But was it that we were looking for volunteers earlier in the year because we didn't have the Chromebooks, or have we always had enough for the students? How did that work? Because I guess that's where my confusion lies.
Good point. We have always had enough, according to instructional technology, albeit some of them were the older white Chromebooks that there were issues with the batteries holding the charges. That's one of the things for the impetus in ordering the new Chromebooks again, and not only at the beginning of the fiscal year, but also in October, was to replace, and we had talked about this before, the obsolescence plan. So we did have the Chromebooks. We were looking to replace those that look like they were going to begin to fail.
Okay. So then now at this point with the 570 that are in, is everybody able to get one of the quote unquote newer ones, I guess we would say? So we don't have to use any of the old white ones anymore, or where does that all stand?
Some of the old Chromebooks are still in service. We are in the process of pushing out those 570, and I know some parents have called eagerly anticipating the delivery of the 312.
Yeah, but the 312 now, it looks like it's not until April, right?
Correct. And again,
Okay.
This is facing every other district, not only in central New York State, but throughout the country. We are targeting one brand over another, again, because of the durability and the Gorilla Glass. So we are trying to go for a higher end Chromebook in terms of its durability. So we might be able to shorten the timeline getting a cheaper version, and I'm purposely not mentioning brand names right now, but we are trying to hold out for the more durable Chromebook with the Gorilla Glass.
Okay, but I just feel awful that those in the high school seem to be shorted, because the note said, I guess, K-8 has not been an issue all year long, right? They always had the newer technology, right?
Yes, we did order the iPads as it indicated on his response. Am I forgetting anything, Dr. Coughlin?
No, I don't think so. The iPads, though, were for kindergarten through second grade, and the new iPads that just came in replaced primarily older iOS versions in kindergarten, and then a smattering in first and second grade.
Okay. Thanks, Dr. Coughlin.
So Dr. Tice, just so if I understand, maybe I was reading this wrong. The freshman class is getting the new ones that came in. The ones they have are being retrieved, and then those older ones are the ones that are being distributed now to 11th and 12th grade.
In terms of repurposing them? Is that what you're? We're
Yes.
trying to push out the newer ones to the freshmen, as you indicated, and then repurposing some of those that are of intermediate age to the upperclassmen, and retiring those white Chromebooks where the battery charge is beginning to fail. Does that help?
Okay.
Trickle down, trickle up, depending on how you look at it. But we're trying to, we collected some Chromebooks over the summer, but as you know, some families kept the Chromebooks in order to participate in our summer online academic review. So all of the Chromebooks did not come in. So this is an effort by instructional technology to be strategic about the deployment of the new Chromebooks, especially to those students who may be using them for a longer period.
Okay. Okay. Thanks.
Any additional questions about the Chromebooks? Okay, thank you very much, Dr. Coughlin, Dr. Tice, and Laurel and Josh. All right. Next on the agenda, item 3.04. So athletics has returned. Dr. Tice?
Certainly. As you know, it's been a crazy weekend starting Friday night with the governor's announcement that high school sports would be able to return pending the approval of the local county health departments. That's why under personnel, you approved the coaches. We do not have another meeting between now and February 1st, but again, it's all contingent upon county approval. As you know, we were one of many school districts to participate in the low-risk fall sports as well as low-risk winter sports. There's a couple teams going on right now. So it really did raise an eyebrow when the governor indicated that high-risk sports would be able to return. I think in part it's due to the fact that with all the testing that has been going on during the first semester, not only in FM, but throughout Central New York and throughout New York State, that the transmission vectors do not appear to be the students, even those that participated in athletics to a degree that we're seeing with adults or college students. So to that end, our athletic director, Mr. Sugar, has been participating in meetings. Section 3 met today. And I can just share with you some of their notes from their meeting today. I know that a lot of districts are wrestling with this decision, whether to go forward with athletics. I'm assuming we will continue to try to provide opportunities for students to maintain as much normalcy as possible, much like we did in the fall and with the winter sports, albeit at the low risk sports. So the idea is that students would be able to participate in consecutive seasons, but cannot play the next sport until their first sport is completed. So this will allow maximum participation for students, but also to limit cross exposures between the teams. We have to keep in mind that we don't have final approval from the county health departments, so they will be weighing in. Item 3, the league that we participate in, Salt City, is starting with no spectators. We're looking to the health department for guidance to be able to increase that like we did with outdoor venues in the fall with 2 spectators per athlete. So for indoor venues, we're looking at no spectators. We're looking into video streaming the events so that families will be able to watch their children participate. We're trying to look again at being league appropriate, regional. We're not looking to travel outside the region and trying to stay close to home, again, to limit the spread, especially if another region is in a yellow, orange, or red zone. We are trying to juggle the coaches. There may be one conflict for a coach that coaches 2 sports, especially with the overlap. We will take a close look at that. We are planning to work with the union in terms of prorating. As you know, the collective bargaining agreement stipulates the remuneration for the coaches as for a complete season. This is only a shorter partial season, so Mr. Gordon will be taking a look at that closely. And then finally, masks will be just like the fall season. They should be worn as tolerated going forward, but this would mean ramping up for the winter season between now, February 1st, and the middle of March. The fall 2 season involving football and a lot of the other sports that were postponed would begin in early March and go until late April. And then finally, spring sports would start mid-April and go until mid-June. So there would be approximately 6, 7, and 8 weeks for winter, fall 2, and spring sports. I know the athletic directors and Section 3 are trying to be as protective of spring sports as possible, in part because spring sports was sacrificed last year at the end. So I do know they're trying to be very cognizant, and that's the reason spring has 8 weeks compared to the others, which are of shorter duration. So I turn it over to you, President Mims. I don't know if the board has any input that they would like to share with me, and I can send it back to our athletic director and back to Section 3.
I'm sure there may be some questions. I had one, and that's, you know, we've had to make changes as just in general as a school district as things have changed or as guidance has changed from the state. Is there going to be some written sort of a checklist or something in writing that says here's how you're able to do this and here's what you have to do? Are they going to send some directives out to us so that we know that we stay in compliance and we are in compliance?
I did, and again, these emails go back and forth. I tried to, I think in an email, respond with the New York State Department of Health, the governor's guidance. Yes. Did the board get that thumbs up? Was that an attachment?
It may be, Dr. Tice. If you think you sent it, I will search through my emails and get it.
But I can share that with you again. This isn't pop quiz. I will send that out again, but they did release something on Friday night when the governor made the announcement. It looks strikingly similar to the guidance that was released in mid-July with the same boilerplate, same template at the top with the Empire State blue and gold branding.
I got it. Thank you.
Okay.
Dr. Tice, there's been obviously a lot of chatter, a lot of rumors about it, and what's true and not is difficult to ascertain sometimes. There was some indication on Friday and Saturday that the state approved it, but kicked it to the local county health departments, who then were going to kick it, if approved, to each individual district. So do we need to take action as a district, as we did in the fall, to say, yes, we are going to be in, which I would be fully in support of?
Yes, I would appreciate guidance going forward. Basically, that's what you did in the fall. I mean, Again, I assumed we're carrying on and going forward. We've talked about the mental health of students and trying to provide as many opportunities. But again, Mr. Seidberg and others, if you feel that there's been a change in the winds and that the board and the governance team feels differently, I would want that information now rather than later.
I'll lay mine out. Fully supportive of let them play.
Yeah.
Dan, I believe, and I could be wrong and everything's happening very quickly, but I believe the assumption we're making is that if Section 3 runs the sports and the local county health commissioner signs off on it, which we're waiting on, that it would only be if we weren't going to have either a certain sport or something that you would have to do any kind of, take any kind of action. Otherwise, it would be assumed that we would participate.
Okay.
So I don't think there'd have to be any formal action to participate, but I could be wrong on that, but that's my understanding at this time.
What's interesting, thank you, Mr. Gordon, and to go back to Mr. Seidberg's comment with all of the circular logic, what's been interesting is that the New York State Public High School Athletic Association, NISFA, as we've talked about before, was kind of left out of the loop too. So they have been reacting, and as you know, they have been advocates. Robert Zayas, the executive director, certainly has shared information with all of us that I have forwarded to you over time, and has been very supportive of trying to get the students back, letting them play, albeit safely. So I think they were taken by surprise because that unit was the last one to react, I think, with everything that happened Friday night. That's why I tried to push out the information to the board Friday night as the news was unfolding.
Craig, you had made one comment in your overview with it that I thought was different than what you had said, which was if there was an overlap between the winter season and the fall two, that I think you had said that a student could not participate in both. I thought the state position on that was that they would be able to participate in both if there was an overlap.
Yes, they would be. I'm sorry. I thought I said they would be able to participate, but would not be able to start the second season until the first one had concluded, is what the section had talked about. So the section was trying to limit spread. Gosh forbid something were to happen with a team in winter season. We wouldn't want to bring fall two to its knees before it even launched from the dock. So the idea was, yes, they could participate, but not until the first season was complete.
Okay, and then my other question, just whether, and like you said, it's fluid, so things are changing literally by the hour on this. Over the weekend, the guidance was still that even though it was an incredibly condensed winter season, that the state was still going to adhere to the minimum number of practices rule before first competition, which was 2 full weeks, in some sports 10 practices. Is that still the case, or is that being shortened also proportionately to the shortening of the season?
My understanding is it's being proportionately shortened.
Okay, great. Well, I think it's great news for our student athletes.
Dr. Tice, I think we all understand and appreciate the importance of athletics to our students. I just wonder if any thought has been given in the last month about any of the after-school activities resuming for the same reason, for our kids' mental health.
Again, we are, at least for the administrators, are embracing this as an opportunity that will open the doors not only for the extracurriculars, as you point out, Ms. Wheeler, but also to the return for school possibly in the fall. We've had a chance to talk to FMTA stewardship about the possibility. I do hope that students, and I know families, are hoping that there will be a return, especially those advocating for more days during the week. And so we're very hopeful that county officials, health officials, everybody can help us get a little bit of a jump start planning for September, as opposed to a lot of these 2-week interval type decisions. I do see some remnants as we go forward, you know, hopefully it'll be masks, you know, or social distancing rather than social distancing. So I do think there will be some remnants regarding the pandemic as it moves forward. But I see the sports as a first domino to fall. And like you said, extracurriculars, and then hopefully the full return of the students. I see this as a positive sign. Again, based on the data from the testing, that there does not seem to be a spread in schools, that the precautions, not only that Fayetteville-Manlius has taken, but other school districts has worked to limit that internal spread, that it's mostly, you know, community household type spread.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Anything further from the board on that item? Okay. Next on the agenda then, item 4.01 is a proposed executive session for the purpose of discussion of a particular the employment history of a particular individual. Is there a motion to adjourn to executive session? Thank you, Rebecca. Second from Jason. Any discussion? All those in favor, please raise your hand, indicate aye. Aye. Anyone opposed or abstaining? All right, so for the members of the public who are watching, we're going to adjourn to executive session and not have any further public business. This would end the public portion of our meeting. So we'll give a few minutes for the live stream to stop, and then